Hello everyone and welcome. This is Nicholas Giardina with MCOL and I'll be your moderator. We're so very happy you could join us today. Our webinar is Understanding MSSP Pathways to Success, Milliman and Analysis and Implications. Our speaker is Colleen Norris, Consulting Actuary with Milliman. Before we get started, we just have a couple of housekeeping items. Our speaker will be taking your questions via the chat feature. And while all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation, you're more than welcome to send in your questions now or at any time throughout the webinar. To chat, please click the blue talk bubble on the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. If you would like to receive a copy of today's presentation, you can download it from register.healthwebsummit.com/Milliman092118.pdf. Lastly, if you require any other assistance, please contact the Healthcare Web Summit office at 209-577-4888. Colleen, we are ready for you to begin.
Thank you, Nicholas, and thank you everyone who's joined for today's presentation. As Nicholas said, today I'm going to be talking about the new proposed rule that came out last month entitled Pathways to Success, and really discuss kind of what this means for the Medicare Shared Savings Plan and how this will significantly impact the participants and new participants who hope to join this program. By way of a quick introduction, my name is Colleen Norris. I am an actuary with Milliman, and it's been my privilege for the last several years now to work with a number of Medicare Shared Savings Plans, ACOs, in this space. So I kind of have a firsthand perspective on kind of their needs, their wants, and really kind of some of the challenges they face in the existing program and some of the ways that this proposed rule may help and hinder them, and I'm hoping to share those with you today throughout this presentation. Before we get started, just a few small caveats. First of all, this should be taken as my perspective only, not of Milliman's more broadly, and also please do not take this as formal actuarial opinion or advice. All right, so getting started here, why should everyone care about ACOs? This really is not just a niche topic of interest for providers. So first of all, in 2018 here, there's already 649 Medicare ACOs, of which 561 are participating in the Medicare Shared Savings Program. The others are participating in smaller programs like NextGen and certain other models. 28% of all Medicare fee-for-service beneficiaries are assigned to a Medicare ACO. That is huge when you think about it. I mean, this program and any changes that impact the Medicare Shared Savings Program are going to have huge ramifications for just a very wide swath of patients across the country, and particularly those who really utilize services heavily in the Medicare fee-for-service program. So I assume that most of you are familiar with this already, but if you're not, the basic concept of a Medicare ACO, or really an ACO more broadly, is that expenditures are measured against a benchmark, and if the ACO drives down costs relative to that benchmark, the ACO and CMS splits the savings. Conversely, under certain models, if an ACO increases costs, then the ACO might need to reimburse CMS for part of the overrun. Sounds simple, right? Usually when I describe this concept to other actuaries or other folks who might not be familiar with it, they're like, well, what is there for you to do there? That's not very hard. It's actually very, very complicated. And I think that's why, first of all, CMS over the last several years has been through several iterations of the rules. And then part of the reason they've proposed such drastic changes here is, I think there's just this ongoing struggle with how do you balance the various needs in the program? How do you balance incentivizing providers to do the right thing with giving them the proper rewards, while at the same time kind of closing some of the loopholes for gaming. This is a really big and persistent challenge, and I'm going to talk about that more as I go through the rule. And many of the things I discussed today they're not clearly upside only or downside only. They have potential to kind of cause both hurt and harm in the ACO program. I mentioned that most ACO models are kind of designed on the premise that if you save money, the savings are split, and if the ACO drives up costs, the cost might be split. Currently in the Medicare ACO program, fully 82% of the Medicare ACOs are currently in an upside-only model. This would mean that they're not responsible for shared losses. This is something that will be highly important as we get into the presentation today. So I want to focus on a line from the press release that came out with the proposed rule. Seema Verma said, "The time has come to put real accountability in accountable care organizations." This is a topic that I think is both important and hotly contested. CMS really has put out this rule from their perspective that there needs to be more structure to force ACOs into greater levels of financial risk taking. However, conversely, you could argue that ACOs already do have some level of financial risk taking. Merely by participating in the program, they've put forth significant capital and investment to participate. And so I think we'll continue to look at this throughout today's presentation and understand, are these levels of risk taking realistic given kind of the structural cost of being an ACO. So let's get started just talking about, at a high level, how things have changed under the proposed rule. First of all, the current track options are being replaced by two main tracks, basic and enhanced. So currently there's 4 main tracks that Medicare Shared Savings ACO program ACOs can take. Track 1, which is upside only, and then tracks 1+, 2, and 3, which are upside and downside, and then the magnitude of the downside risk increases as you go up to track 3. These, like I said, these are being replaced by 2 tracks. The first one is the basic track, which you can see here I've kind of put that as replacing both track 1 and 1+. The basic track actually has 5 levels and transitions ACOs from risk that's very similar to the current track 1, meaning upside only, to risk that's very similar to the current track 1+, which is upside and downside, but with some pretty significant limits on how much downside risk that an ACO is subject to. Track 2 is essentially going away, and then track 3 is staying in almost its current form exactly, and is being renamed the enhanced track. In this track, the financial parameters are exactly the same as track 3. So I mentioned that in the basic track, there is what CMS is calling a glide path of 5 different levels. And within each of these 5 different levels, the financial parameters and a few other important parameters vary slightly. So first of all, within the glide path, levels A and B are one-sided only, and then starting in level C, CMS requires that ACOs will take 2-sided risk. Additionally, in each level of the glide path, an ACO is allowed to choose their beneficiary assignment methodology. More on that in a little bit. They're also allowed to annually elect into a higher risk level. So what does that mean? So first of all, for an ACO who starts in the glide path, so let's say a new ACO who enters the program in 2020 can, let's say they decide to start in basic level A, they will automatically be advanced every year into the next level of risk. So you start in 2020 in level A, automatically go to level B in 2021, etc. You keep it on advancing automatically. You do have the option, however, of advancing more quickly. So for example, if you start in level A in 2020, you would have the choice to advance to level B in 2021, for example, if you so choose. Finally, one other thing that's very important for distinguishing these levels under the basic track glide path is the advanced APM status under the QPP. So what is this? Under MAAA, physicians are allowed, if they participate in certain advanced alternative payment models, can have a qualifying participant designation. And if they have the qualifying participant designation, they get a 5% bonus on their Medicare Fee-for-Service Part B services for at least a few more years. So this is obviously highly valuable, and that status can be available starting at the glide path level E. So let's also talk about a few more financial parameters for each of these levels on the glide path. So first of all, minimum savings rate and minimum loss rate, that's what's indicated by MSR and MLR. This is important. So the basic concept here is that ACOs have a corridor in which they are not responsible for shared savings or shared losses. The basic premise here is that if an ACO has a very small shared loss, they might not want to be responsible for it because it might just be due to random fluctuation. On the flip side, if they have a very small shared savings, again, they might not be responsible for it because it's due to random variation. There's pros and cons to different MSRs and MLRs, which I'll talk about later in this presentation. But for now, we'll just leave it by describing the basic parameters of which are available. Under levels A and B in the glide path, the minimum savings and minimum loss rate are actually based on the ACO size, which is exactly the same way it happens for Track 1 currently. So these can be as low as 2% and go up to around 4% based on size. For levels C, D, and E, and then the enhanced track, you actually have a choice of minimum savings and minimum loss rate of between 0% and 2% in 0.5% increments. Now, the next major parameter that distinguishes these tracks financially is the shared savings rate. So you can see these here go from 25% up to 75%, in each case multiplied by the quality score. So a few things that have really changed here. Previously under Track 1, the shared savings rate for Track 1 was 50% times the quality score. You can see here that for the comparable levels A and B, that has been reduced to 25%, which gradually increases to 50% by the time the ACO is in basic level E, and then that jumps to 75% in the enhanced track. CMS has done this because I think their belief is that if you're in one-sided risk only, they feel like they should not have to share a substantial portion of the shared savings with the ACO. The flip side to this argument, of course, is that the ACO is investing significant capital just by virtue of being in part of this program, and therefore they feel like it would be more appropriate to have a higher shared savings rate. Okay, the next column is the shared loss rate. So you can see here that obviously there's no shared losses for basic level A and B, and then it's a fixed 30% for levels C, D, and E. This is actually very consistent with the current level Track 1 Plus, which has that fixed shared loss rate. For the enhanced track, the shared loss rate is a little bit different, and the way it's structured is basically a minimum or a maximum of 40% or 1 minus the sharing rate. That sounds a little bit complicated, but really what you need to know is that for most ACOs, unless they have an incredibly low quality score, that's just going to fix their shared loss rate at 40%. Now, in my opinion, the most interesting part of the financial parameters that CMS changed under this new proposed rule are the loss sharing limits. So recall that the enhanced track has replaced Track 3, and so the loss sharing limit there, as it was with Track 3, is 15% of the updated benchmark. However, for basic levels C, D, and E, CMS has made an interesting parameter change where the loss sharing limit can be the lesser of a percent of revenue or a percent of the updated benchmark. So let's just talk about this really quickly. What does this mean? So percent of benchmark. The benchmark is based on the beneficiary's total cost of care in Medicare Parts A and B. So let's say a beneficiary's total cost of care is on average $10,000 per person per year. Then 4% of that is $400 per person, and so on. So that doesn't sound like a lot. However, if you are a small physician practice and you're only responsible, your revenue is a very small percentage of a person's total cost of care. Let's say your total revenue is $500. You can see how a potential liability of $400 per person per year could potentially be catastrophic and bankrupting. Therefore, CMS has made this alternate option where the loss sharing limit could be a percent of total Parts A and B revenue. We'll talk about that a little bit more here in a few slides. Okay, So let's talk about ACO entry options, since we've talked so much about the glide path and the basic levels and the enhanced levels. So essentially there's three different parameters on which that will determine an ACO's entry options. First of all, their applicant type, if they're a new legal entity or if they're renewing or re-entering. Second, if they're considered experienced or inexperienced. And third, if they're considered high or low revenue. So you can see here that essentially any inexperienced ACO is going to be allowed to enter the basic plan glide path. The only difference there is if they're renewing or re-entering, they will have to enter in level B as opposed to level A, so that's a relatively small change. You can see this becomes very different, though, if an ACO is considered to be experienced, and especially if they're considered to be high revenue. So if they're experienced, they do not have the option of entering the basic plan along the glide path. And if they're high revenue, they have to enter the enhanced track. They have no option of entering at the basic plan level E at all. So since this is so important, let's talk about what makes an ACO experienced versus inexperienced. An ACO is determined to be experienced if either of the following conditions apply. First of all, either an ACO is previously participated in a performance-based Medicare ACO initiative or had deferred entry into a second MSSP agreement period under Track 2 or Track 3, or an ACO that participated in a two-sided model or that remained in Track 1 for their second agreement period. These are considered experienced. So essentially, for ACOs that break up and reform as a different entity, if 40% or more of the ACO's providers participated in a performance-based risk initiative or were part of this deferred renewal arrangement in any part of the 5 most recent performance years, then they are definitely considered experienced. Furthermore, performance-based performance-based Medicare ACO initiatives includes Track 1+, 2, 3, Pioneer Model, NextGen, and a few others here. So you can see here, this is basically how CMS has defined experience, and it's the broad definition here is if you have participated in a shared risk track or have been in a one-sided risk track long enough, you will be determined to be experienced. All right, let's talk about the other major inflection point that's so important for determining entry into an ACO. This is if you are considered high revenue or low revenue. So conceptually, what CMS is trying to do here is separate ACOs with low total revenue where shared losses could potentially bankrupt an ACO. This is very similar to what I was talking about before with a small PCP practice. Their total revenue is going to be a very small share of a total beneficiary's annual expenses. So essentially, an ACO is low revenue if ACO's total Medicare revenue is less than 25% of total expenditures for Parts A and B beneficiaries. Otherwise, an ACO is considered high revenue. So it's very important here to notice one key distinction. We're not talking about total Medicare revenue for all ACO beneficiaries. We're talking about total Medicare revenue. So this would be for any patients, any Medicare patients that are served by a practice, whether or not they are attributed, assigned, or potentially assigned to an ACO. All right, so with that, I think it's helpful to talk about a few examples of savings and loss differences between tracks because they are really substantial. In particular, the differences between level E and the enhanced track. So let's take an example here of an ACO with a $10,000 benchmark, 20,000 beneficiaries, and a quality score of 90%. You can see here that the savings percentages are somewhat different between level E, which is 45%, so that would be the 50% base shared savings rate times 0.9, versus the 67.5 shared savings rate for enhanced, again, 75% times the 0.9. The loss percentage is also slightly different. You can see here that it's 30% for level E and 32.5 for enhanced. You can see here, though, really where the biggest difference comes in if you were having to choose between tracks is there are slight differences in kind of the shared savings or shared loss for kind of small dollar loss or savings percentages. However, the really significant difference comes in is when you're considering maximum loss. In this case, for an ACO, it would be only $8 million under level E as opposed to $30 million under the enhanced track. Of course, you have to keep in mind that the possibility of triggering the maximum shared loss is really rather remote in either case, and it's especially remote for the enhanced track, but it is still worth noting. Okay, one other thing I wanted to talk about in more detail was the revenue versus benchmark-based cap. I'll describe this in a little bit more detail. So this gives a quick example of how this would be calculated for an ACO. First of all, the way CMS determines the cap, and again this applies for the basic level C, D, and E, is that it takes the ACO's total updated benchmark expenditures, and multiplies it by a nominal standard percentage. And in this case, the 4% would be what it will be for basic level E in 2019. And that would be the benchmark-based cap of here, which is about $3.7 million. Under the revenue-based approach, it would take the ACO participants' total Medicare Part A and B revenue, which for this particular example is less than the benchmark, multiply that by the nominal standard percentage, which here is 8%, to get the revenue-based cap. And CMS will basically take the lesser of these two, which in this case would be the revenue-based cap. All right. With that, we're going to talk about a few important changes that CMS has made to the benchmark in the proposed rule. All right, so the first major change they've made to the financial benchmark is the agreement length. CMS is moving the length of the agreement period from 3 years to 5 years. It's really significant, and it has several implications, including, first of all, the assigned beneficiary population in later performance years may look really different from the assigned population in the benchmark years due to the 7-year gap between the first benchmark year and the last performance year. That's really quite significant. Also, the longer agreement period will really magnify the effects of the proposed 3% cap on risk adjustment and trend changes, which I'll discuss a little bit later in this presentation. So ACOs with a stable participant list can expect to have a relatively stable benchmark due to both a longer agreement period and the risk adjustment cap that we'll discuss later. However, if you're an ACO that has major changes in your population, or who has big changes in the care practice patterns of your existing participant list, the 5-year assignment window may be less of an advantage. All right, the next change is the change to the regional fee-for-service adjustment. So currently, for those of you who are familiar with the Medicare fee-for-service program, the Medicare fee-for-service ACO program, know that Medicare has been moving in the direction of incorporating regional experience as part of the benchmark. The reason they're doing this is twofold. First of all, if you are more competitive, if you're an ACO and your costs are higher than your region, you enter in with a competitive advantage due to the fact that you could potentially lower your costs more aggressively than someone who is already rather lean and mean in their operating expenditures. Furthermore, let's say you're an ACO and you're several years into the program, you've brought down your costs. There's kind of this effect where over time you begin kind of chasing your own tail and you're having to compete against your past performance. Medicare obviously wants to kind of limit these two effects, and that's why even in the prior program they introduced the regional fee-for-service blending. The way this works is that a benchmark experience is based on a combination of an ACO's prior experience mixed with a risk-adjusted blend of experience in the region, which is based on counties. Under current methodology, the regional blending only started in agreement period 2 and then increased in proportion up until agreement period 4. Under the proposed methodology, CMS proposes to start the regional blending immediately in agreement period 1, and then again increase kind of the proportions in agreement period 2, 3, and 4, similar as to before, but this time capping it out at a 50-50 blend rather than a 70% regional blend as they had had in their prior rule. Okay, one of the other really significant changes is risk adjustment. So risk adjustment is currently used in 3 ways. First of all, to risk adjust each historical benchmark year to benchmark year 3. Also, to risk adjust a regional benchmark to the ACO's average risk by enrollment type to calculate the fee-for-service adjustment. And finally, to risk adjust the ACO's historical benchmark to each performance year and split between continuing members and new members. The first 2 risk adjustment mechanisms are not changing under the proposed rule. However, CMS is proposing to make a really big change to the risk adjustment mechanism in the 3rd piece. So for those of you who are familiar with it, the way that risk adjustment currently works is CMS divides the population into two subgroups, continuing and newly assigned. The designation here is a little bit complicated, but essentially continuing is members who have been potentially assigned to the ACO for 2 consecutive periods. For these members, the way CMS currently handles them is that their risk scores cannot go up. So in the event that risk scores do go up, CMS will take their benchmark year 3 risk score and multiply it by a demographic adjustment to account for the fact that these people do age somewhat, but that's all that it will account for. Conversely, for this continuing population, if their risk score actually decreases, CMS will acknowledge that. So it is kind of a fundamentally lopsided program the way it is now. What CMS is doing is they're completely doing away with this designation, and they're going to say, we're going to take your real risk ratio, but we're just going to cap it at plus or minus 3%. Now, is it possible that the real true risk score of the population could change more than plus or minus 3%? Of course. But from my perspective, I do see this as a huge improvement because I have personally witnessed quite a few ACOs who their actual morbidity of their population did increase, and oftentimes did increase substantially by 1 or 2%. And then they subsequently had that capped, which was reflected in a lower benchmark and seriously harmed their ability to achieve shared savings. Okay, the next piece of the benchmark change is trend. So trends are used to adjust all historical benchmarks to benchmark year 3, and then from benchmark year 3 to each performance year. Currently, agreement period 1 uses national trend adjustment, and agreement period 2 and beyond uses regional trend adjustments. So CMS is proposing to use a blend of regional and national trends for all agreement periods weighted by market share. And this will be done separately by each of the 4 beneficiary categories. So essentially the way this is done is a neat little trick that CMS is using to kind of get around some of the prior problems with the regional adjustment. So previously, if you were in a region previously if you were an ACO and you dominated a region, you were essentially setting your own trend, which is clearly a problem. Now, CMS is basically acknowledging that that is an issue and is going to use a ratio of national to regional trend that basically reflects your penetration in a region. So for example, if you have 80% penetration in a region, the regional piece of the trend will only represent 80%, and you would have approximately a 80% national trend. That way you are not setting your own trend factor. All right, there's a few other really big changes to the assignment methodology. First of all, there are several new codes used for assignment. These are really interesting, and we think will change the number of people assigned and potentially have some interesting implications. So there are several new codes used for assignment. We think that for some ACOs who are particularly good at coding for additional services, particularly coding for services where they're helping people kind of spend additional time with them, helping them coordinate their care, helping them really understand their diagnoses. This will help them draw additional people into their ACO. Conversely, if an ACO is in a region where they are not doing these particularly well, but other carriers are, they might need to, they could potentially lose membership and therefore might need to focus on how to really provide these services at a higher level. Second of all, there's changes to how primary care services are considered when a patient is in a skilled nursing facility. This is an area where the methodology has changed a bit over time. Initially, there was no special consideration for this. Starting in 2017, what CMS did was they started excluding primary care services where there was a place of service of 31, indicating a SNF, on the claim line. Now, the reason that CMS did this was they didn't want primary care services that happened within a skilled nursing facility to drive attribution. They felt that these services were not indicative of where a patient was getting the bulk of their primary care outside of the skilled nursing facility in a community-based setting. They're making a small change to this going forward, where instead of looking for claim lines where there was a primary care service and a place of service equal to 31, they're now going through and they're going to make a separate file and look at any days where a person was in a skilled nursing facility and then exclude any primary care services that happened on those same days. I think we have yet to kind of have a full understanding of how much this could potentially impact attribution. I know when the original change was made, it seemed like a small thing, and then it had some significant impacts for ACOs, both in terms of increasing and decreasing attribution and benchmark. I know internally within Milliman, we're in the process of doing some research to understand how much, if at all, we would expect this to make a significant change on attribution for ACOs. Finally, a rather significant change, CMS will offer the choice of either retrospective or prospective beneficiary assignment under both the basic and enhanced tracks for ACOs. So this is really pretty significant. So going to this one with the assignment methodology and option of choice, there's a few things to consider for ACOs deciding whether they want to be under prospective or retrospective attribution. So first of all, who is included in the assigned population? There's really some significant trade-offs here. So first of all, under retrospective assignment, the assigned population is based on the services that actually happened during the performance year. However, the assigned population is unknown until the final settlement report, and therefore preliminary estimates for either costs or who is actually who's going to be in the final report or risk adjustment scores, they can change dramatically over the course of the year. Conversely, under prospective assignment, the assigned population is largely known going into the performance year. However, because assignment does not reflect performance year care patterns, the ACO may be responsible for beneficiaries who don't actually receive care in the ACO during the performance year. Another feature to consider is the number of assigned beneficiaries. Typically, the number of assigned beneficiaries drops by 5 to 10% under prospective assignment as compared to retrospective assignment. Larger differences have been seen to occur in areas with higher Medicare Advantage penetration. This is particularly important for ACOs who are near the cutoff of having a minimum of 5,000 beneficiaries. It's also important for ACOs who are near the cutoff of the 25% threshold for being lower high revenue. This can actually have an impact there as well. Finally, priority of assignment. Prospective assignment does have priority over retrospective assignment. So, in other words, a beneficiary who is prospectively assigned to an ACO cannot also be assigned to another ACO during a performance year. This is particularly impactful if you're in a competitive region and there's multiple ACOs and you would like to have your ACO have priority of assignment over others. Okay, so it's worthwhile to kind of think about how to explore how much your beneficiaries might change if you go from a retrospective to a prospective model. This is pretty straightforward to do if you have your quarterly and annual assignment files. Essentially, you take a unique list and you identify members who have been added and who have been dropped throughout the year, and you count those up and summarize them in a composite table. I'm going to quickly go to that composite table because it's honestly more interesting than just going through the steps of how to do it. But essentially, if you go through that analysis described on the prior slide, you will get to a table much like this. So the values here are hypothetical, but I think the results and what to interpret from them are very real and important. So first of all, under preliminary assignment, let's say we have an ACO who had 20,000 members. Under both prospective and retrospective, there are the same general exclusions that occur. So these would be people who die prior to the start of the performance year, people who join a Medicare Advantage plan, people who move out of the country, etc. So in both of these cases, that would be the same 1,000 people who are excluded. However, based on that analysis I just described, you can see that there would be 8,000 beneficiaries added due to performance year utilization patterns under retrospective. And then there would be 6,000 beneficiaries removed due to performance year utilization patterns under retrospective. So this is really important because essentially what that's saying is, not only do you have about 2,000 more people assigned under retrospective as you do under prospective, which is impactful. What this is also saying is that you have fully 6,000 people who would have been dropped under retrospective that you will now be responsible for under prospective. This means that they either got no primary care in the ACO or not enough during the performance year to be assigned. Likewise, there are 8,000 people who would be assigned under retrospective, would not be assigned under prospective, and you won't get credit for them one way or the other. I'm not saying this is like this is not meant to say definitely go retrospective or definitely go prospective. I do think it's important, though, for ACOs to go through this exercise on their own and really kind of understand the trade-offs, because there's clearly pros and cons to each of these methods, and I think that really understanding kind of the numbers can help an ACO inform their decisions. Okay, there are a few other key changes that I want to discuss here quickly. So first of all, beneficiary opt-in. This is a program feature that's currently not available, but CMS is proposing an option for ACOs to choose an alternative opt-in beneficiary assignment methodology. So this is really different, and under this approach, a beneficiary would be assigned to an ACO if the beneficiary decided to opt in. It's a really radical change that CMS is proposing. It's not clear to me that many ACOs would take this option, but it's certainly an interesting one to consider. Secondly, the SNF waiver. Many of you will be familiar with this because it is already available to participants in tracks 1, plus, and 3. Interestingly, CMS has decided to expand this waiver to all ACOs in all performance-based risk levels. So this would be ACOs in levels C, D, E of the basic track, or any ACOs in the enhanced track. And one of the things that's really interesting about this is this will be regardless of the assignment methodology chosen. Currently, this has only been available to ACOs who have prospective methodology. Going forward, it will be available to all ACOs regardless of if it's prospective or current or retrospective, and CMS is providing a much more wider net of kind of a safe harbor for if you provide a SNF waiver covered service to a member who is not ultimately assigned to the ACO, CMS will still cover that for most cases. The third major change is telehealth. So it's not that telehealth is not currently covered under the Medicare ACO program, it's just that it's covered under such extremely limited circumstances it's really not used. Medicare is very much broadly expanding the definition of telehealth under this proposed rule, and they're including circumstances where a member could receive telehealth services in their home and they're also removing most geographic restrictions. The only difference here is that this will only be available to Medicare ACOs in the shared risk tracks and also those under prospective assignment. So finally, incentive payments. This is a really interesting change as well. So currently, kind of like telehealth, it's not that there is no ability for Medicare ACO to do incentive payments. They're just so restricted it barely ever happens. Currently, it really can only be certain in-kind services for members who participate in healthy behaviors. Medicare is proposing to expand this quite broadly, where ACOs and performance-based risk tracks would be able to provide incentive payments of up to $20 per beneficiary for each qualifying primary care service. Now, there are several caveats here, including the one that you cannot actually target your beneficiaries. You have to kind of give this to everyone, but it is really an interesting option that they proposed for how to broaden incentive payments and kind of improve member engagement. So with that, I want to talk through several implications, and I'm going to go kind of back through the slide deck and kind of talk about the so what of everything that we've just been through, because there's quite a lot. So way back at the beginning of the presentation, we were talking about the ACO entry options. We were talking about the basic glide path, the basic level E, and the enhanced. And we had also talked about how there were significant levels in aggregate risk between level E and enhanced. As you can see, this really raises the stakes for a number of ACOs who might want to really stay with level E because of the much lower level of aggregate risk, which then raises the question, how can more ACOs become, classify themselves as low revenue? This is particularly interesting. So if we go back to kind of our definition of low revenue ACO, essentially an ACO is low revenue if ACO total Medicare revenue is less than 25% of total expenditures for Part A and B beneficiaries. So what does this mean? When we've looked at this independently in the Medicare 5% data, we have, it's possible to kind of look at this by specialty type. What we've noticed is that most primary care type providers would certainly fall under this low revenue definition if evaluated on their own, whereas most specialty providers would certainly fall under the high revenue definition. And typically when we've looked at this, we've seen that independently on an NPI level, most primary care providers tend to be more in the 10 to 20% range of this ratio, whereas specialty providers might be in the 50 to honestly above 100% range. So what does this mean for ACOs? So for ACOs who are absolutely committed to having a broad specialty network, or for ACOs who are fundamentally hospital-based, they are not really going to have much of an option here. They're probably just going to be classified as high revenue ACOs, but they might want to think about, how do they handle this? How do they handle this higher level of aggregate risk that they're going to be forced to take under the enhanced track? So recall that part of the benefits of being in level E or the enhanced track is that all of your providers receive this qualifying participant bonus, which is 5% of their Part B expenditures, or Part B revenue, excuse me. So in my work with ACOs, I've noticed that an increasing number are kind of evaluating the option of how to kind of have a membership fee of sorts for their providers. So for example, if you have a number of specialty providers in your ACO, their impact on assigned members is going to be relatively low. Sure, they will see those assigned members. They will be responsible for, attributing relatively few of them, but they're going to get that 5% bonus on everyone they see who's part of Medicare Fee-for-Service. I have seen several ACOs who are interested in possibly setting up kind of a membership fee based on your specialty type or even just your aggregate Medicare ACO revenue, and that's an interesting option here. Certainly one that ACOs could consider. Another thing is that for ACOs who might be near the threshold or who just absolutely cannot tolerate the higher level of risk in the enhanced track, they could look at possibly removing providers from their they could look at removing providers from their ACO to come in below the 25% threshold. This is a relatively straightforward analysis to do where you can look at these same numerator and denominator levels on a NPI or a 10 basis and then determine, kind of prioritize like who might need to be removed from the ACO to come in under the threshold. Again, not making any recommendations here. These are just options that are available to ACOs who are looking to kind of stay in one level or another. I will add here that the same general consideration could apply for the revenue versus benchmark-based cap. Clearly, the high versus low revenue designation is typically the greater priority, but for ACOs who are looking to reduce their overall expenditure or exposure, they could continue to look at removing specialty care providers as a way to lower their overall risk under the revenue-based approach. All right. So one more thing here. So under assignment methodology choice, this is another area where ACOs are going to need to really carefully consider their choice in relation to the lower high revenue threshold. So as we were just kind of talking through that, notice that the denominator is based on the number of total, got kind of a cold, you can probably tell here. I'm just going to skip this slide real quick. All right. So with that, I'm going to wrap up and go to any questions. All right, are there any questions out there? While we're waiting for any questions, I'll just make a few general comments about kind of the shared risk levels in the new proposed options. So I kind of mentioned this briefly early on in the presentation, how under current track 1, there was a 50% shared savings rate, and now under the current basic levels A and B, there's only a 25% shared savings rate. I know this is an area that there's quite a bit of concern from me personally and then from some others in the ACO community that this is just not enough to merit the investment that it takes to participate in an ACO. I know there's been just a lot of just kind of concern and worry about this, and I do hope that CMS might consider another option in their final rule just so that the potential shared savings is high enough to make it worth it for ACOs. All right, I see someone has a hand raised. Okay, great. So someone asked, does the 3% cap on risk score discourage from serving high-risk cases? This is a really great question, and I think there's an important way to think about this here. So the 3% risk cap, it really, so essentially it's looking at the difference between the risk score in benchmark year 3 and the performance year. So if there were high-risk cases that the providers were serving in both benchmark year 3 and in the performance year, no, not necessarily. However, I would say that if there have been changes in practice patterns where an existing 10 within the ACO was previously serving kind of more traditional risk cases and has moved towards serving higher risk cases, then I would say yes, that could be a real deterrent. However, I would say that could have been a deterrent under the existing program already because many of those people might have already been captured as continuously assigned. So it's an interesting point, and I certainly think one that's worth exploring, but I think that so long as, changes in practice patterns have long been an issue in the Medicare Shared Savings Program assignment methodology logic, and I could get into all sorts of reasons why. I think the risk cap is going to be another reason why those would be a problem, but I would argue that those were already kind of a problem in the current program design.
Okay, we would like to take this opportunity to thank our speaker and all of our participants for joining today. We will be sending a follow-up post-event feedback via email before the close of business today, and we would love to receive any feedback that you wish to share. If you haven't already done so, please be sure to join our LinkedIn group where you can post questions, start discussions, and suggest topics for future events. This now concludes our webinar.